Okay, so just want to start by saying that this was a really remarkable symposium in my view. For non-Hebrew speakers, it's amazing to learn about the complexity of the verb system in Hebrew and the many aspects of meaning that get encompassed in the verb morphology. Just a quick review of what I have understood about the way the system works. So we have the roots, which are typically three consonants, consonant 1, 2, 3. And then there are 7 what they call binyanim, which are really conjugations, but they're not arbitrary conjugations, such as I'm used to from French, for example, but they are derivationally defined conjugations. So they express different aspects of actions or voice or transitivity. So you have transitive ones and intransitive ones, and middle and passive, and so on. And then for each binyan or conjugation, verb conjugation, there are 3 to 5 possible temporal expressions, so present, past, future, imperative, and infinitive. And finally, the last thing that gets expressed in the verb form is an additional affixal expression of the subject, agreement, gender, and number. And I neglected to say that what's interesting, particularly special in Semitic systems, is that the binyan, the conjugation expression, is something that gets intercalated with the consonant slots provided by the root. So it's a very special kind of system. And the question for us here is, how does anyone learn such a system? How is the system learned? So in order to find that out, our speakers have provided an amazing amount of information, tremendous size of data that is available, developmental data that they have made available over many years. So in particular, what's been referred to in these talks, so there are a lot of papers referring to these data as well now, child-directed speech and child speech for children aged 1-8 to 2 years 2 months, and also peer talk at 6 different ages, covering the period from age 2 to age 8. So that is the database, and then we have the very innovative use of network analysis to study the developmental growth in both complexity and, I would say, systematicity over that period from basically not quite 2 to age 8. And then through this network analysis, visualization that's possible, the changes in complexity, comparing the adult speech to child speech and the children over different ages, I find that very interesting, but really difficult to penetrate. I think it's quite opaque for somebody who doesn't know the Hebrew. So what's wonderful about the network model is, the network analysis model, is that it allows you to have quantitative results as well. So that's basically what we're dealing with here. So what have we learned? Well, I would say the single thing that stands out for the very young children, who are of most interest to me because that's my area, is that the children and their interlocutors, their parents, clearly begin with a very heavy use of one conjugation or binyan, which is called kal. I think they begin with that one because it is the most frequent, it is the most frequently used in child-directed speech, and therefore it is used the most in child speech. It's what they hear the most. One reason is that it's easy for the children, I think, is that the temporal patterns are the most phonologically distinct in that particular conjugation. And then another reason perhaps why it's used so much more by the adults is that the verb function is the most basic. So you have basic transitive verbs expressed in that conjugation very often. And there was mention in one of the slides that the roots are the most coherent. I'm not entirely sure what that means. That could be a question for the speakers. I think it means that there are more different verbs that have related meanings within this conjugation. I'm not actually entirely sure about that. Okay, so one of the measures that the network analysis gives us is density. That's one of the major measures. And what we find, this is something that is discussed in a couple of the talks, is that the younger children pick up on just a relatively small set of verb forms. They are specific high frequency verb roots that are used in that frequent binyan, kal, and also a couple of others. So the transitivity types that they pick up on are the ones that are used the most. And they have what the network analysis calls high centrality, which means each of the links between roots and particular conjugations are themselves connected with a lot of other roots and conjugations. So each element in the system is highly connected, and that makes a very dense cluster of connections. And that's what the children pick up on. So they have a very dense system to begin with. And that seems to be, the way I understand it, a kind of item learning. They pick up on what is occurring the most often, and in Hebrew, that means both a particular conjugation type and a small set of verb roots. So that's a little bit like starting with the past tense irregular in English before you begin to pick up the regular system, which is much more widely used, more types, but it's not as high frequency in the early speech input. And then the children use and reuse that small set of forms, so they continue to have a very dense system for quite a while. And there's very slow growth in terms of adding entirely new roots and new transitivity types, which eventually does happen, which allows for more productivity in later years. But in the earliest years, up to about age 3, there's a lot of reuse of a small set of patterns. So slow growth in a small, heavily used area. So that's very interesting in itself. As the children, I think, as the children gain experience by hearing the language every day and beginning to interact with more varied speakers as they get a little older, then they begin to attempt more unfamiliar forms, branching out to new roots and new patterns, new roots and new conjugations. And one would then expect to see more error. So error is one of the things that wasn't covered in the talks that we heard today. And I'm quite curious about that. I wonder just how that transition to beginning to use more unfamiliar forms looks like. And it looks as if that probably doesn't really happen in large numbers until perhaps the early school years. So what I would really like to see is a model of illustrations of exactly how that transition takes place. The model is very good at long-term trends, but it's not intuitive to somebody who doesn't know Hebrew. And so it would be really nice to see 1 or 2 children's verb forms, let's say from recording to recording over a period of time, to see where they start making errors and what kinds of errors they make. So I'm very curious to know, do they make mistakes in picking the wrong conjugation, the wrong derivational meaning for a particular verb, or do they use some roots that never occur in that particular pattern? They overgeneralize a root from one conjugation to another, or do they misanalyze where the intercalating vowels fit in with the consonants? Is that a kind of error they make? So at the moment, I don't know anything about that, but I'm quite curious. So now just a few speakers. I have a question for each of the speakers. Dorit Ravid mentioned that the root is the most accessible Hebrew morpheme. I thought that was really interesting, and I wonder what that means. In what sense are the roots more accessible? Who are they more accessible to? The root seems very abstract to an outsider, because it's not always that you get CV. You can get CVCC or CCDC. The three consonants move around in terms of where they co-occur with the vowels, and picking out that root is not so easy for somebody who doesn't know Hebrew. So I'm wondering, why does she say that? And is it the case that children seem to have access on it from early on, or by 7 or 8, or was she perhaps talking about adult speakers? So that's a question for Dorit. And then for both Elitsur Daphner and Orit Ashkenazi, my question is, I'm not sure why they are interested in positing a network for each day in their conversations between parents and children. What kind of reality does that reflect? So they talk about the network predicting what will be in the next network, or influencing the children's network, influencing the parents' network on the next day. But I'm not quite sure why they would want to do that, because I usually don't like to emphasize competence performance differences, because I think performance is constantly creating new competence. That's a usage-based approach. But here, it looks as if we're focusing on the particular performance on a given day and gathering what the network is from that. But the network surely exists from one day to the next. And so, because it's really knowledge, and the knowledge isn't going to go away, even if you don't use a particular form. If you used it yesterday or used it several times, you probably have a representation for it. It may be more or less robust. So I don't quite understand what they're thinking there. It'd be good to hear an answer from them. And my last question is for Ronit Levy. So she gives a really fascinating insight into the changes in density that I was talking about over time as the growth of complexity and pattern knowledge changes as the children get older. But one of the findings she has is that the children tend to use past tense forms more, or the most, up to about age 3, and then they use more present tense forms. And I'm wondering, why is that? Why are the past tense used more? Is it something to do with their phonology, perhaps, or is it about the kind of discourse topic? I don't know what the reason might be. Okay, so those are my questions, and thank you very much.